Cleopatra, Jesus, Napoleon. It takes a lot to get first name famous. So today we're going to talk about Napoleon Bonaparte, the GOAT of all time. Is that redundant? Yes, but he deserves it. Now there are a gorillion and one videos on Napoleon's military exploits, his brilliance on the battlefield. This video is going to be a little different. It's going to talk about some of the cooler personal things Napoleon did, from his civic reforms to his administration to some of the more badass things in his personal life, or some of the more eccentric dealings he had. So, a little bit of background. Napoleon was not French, he was Italian, kind of like Christopher Columbus, right? Not Spanish, also Italian. Christopher Columbus was from Genoa. Napoleon was from Corsica, which is this, I wouldn't call it small exactly. It's a decent-sized island off the coast of Italy. You can see it, the French territory in green there, and the Italian territory in pink. For a long time, Corsica belonged to Italy. Corsica is full of Italians. And the Bonapartes are an old Roman family. If you watch my previous video about Cesare Borgia, you'll know about the Della Rovere, the Orsini, the Colonna, these old patrician families. Well, the Bonapartes were descended from them. They held no noble titles, but they were a well-to-do family. To make an analog to today, you could probably consider them middle class, upper middle class. They were established, and Napoleon's father was a bit of a Corsican nationalist, actually. Well, when he became of age, he and his older brother Joseph were sent to France to study at the École Militaire, which is a famous military academy. Napoleon studied artillery, as he wanted to become an artillery officer. Now, one of the first things is Napoleon was a huge writer, really into literature. He studied the classics, the greats. He was very humble about it. One of his best quotes is, Julius Caesar thought he was a failure by 20 when he did not conquer as much as Alexander, or something like that. And that was Napoleon saying, like, hey, you have time, don't stress out. And that's just a kind of a chill thing to say. But in terms of literature, he dabbled a bit in maybe what you would call today fan fiction during this era. He wrote this novella about a Corsican sailor who gets bloody revenge on his French shipmates and massacres them in their sleep. And they actually submitted this to a gazette in France and got it published because he wrote it in French. And it's just kind of funny that he wrote this kind of fanfic-esque novella about that and actually got it published while he was in France studying. During this period, in kind of like his angsty teenage phase, because he was like 16 here when he was studying, getting top marks in mathematics and map making and logistics, he was really a Corsican nationalist. Now, Napoleon for his whole life, he picked up French very quickly, but he spoke it with a Corsican accent. You'll notice in movies and pop culture, Napoleon always speaks with a kind of a cha-cha-cha-cha-cha-cha kind of staccato, and I think that's them trying to represent his Italian accent, specifically Corsican regional dialect, which, is interesting. It gives him a lot of character. So, let's get this straight. Napoleon was 5'6". That's not short. That's Angloid propaganda, is what it is, okay? Today, in the US, 5'9" is average, all right? Back then, because people have gotten taller. Okay, they haven't gotten taller, but through nutrition and all this other nonsense, like, people grow to their full potential. And a lot of times, people didn't grow to their full potential. 5'6" is normal. 5'6" is totally normal. That's the Angloids trying to get in your mind, okay? Don't let them do it. So Napoleon kept very detailed journals at this time, kind of autistically. And one of the funnier parts is his first sensual encounter with a lady of the night, a streetwalker, you may say, but a very high-class one. And Napoleon's first night with her, he recounts in vivid detail, which is kind of funny. So Napoleon eventually graduates from the École Militaire with top marks, and he becomes commissioned as what we would call a second lieutenant today, the first officer rank. Now, this is during the French Revolution, right? And during the Terror, the worst, bloodiest part of it, where that freak Maximilien Robespierre was in control with his cult of the Supreme Being and all his atheist bullshit. That didn't really make any sense. And the terror, and everything was crazy all over the place. So, hilariously, Napoleon is like, he just got his commission. He's like, all right, I'm taking time off. Time off for what? You just graduated. I'm taking it, kid. So he goes basically AWOL for months, for a couple months, all right? No one really knows where he is. He's messing around in Marseille. He's hanging out with his friends. He goes back to Corsica for a little bit, see his family, then he comes back. And he demands back pay from his commanding officer. And they are so short on competent officers. Because remember, all the officers were either guillotined, exiled, or they fled France, because they're all mostly aristocrats or gentlemen of good breeding and talent. And they want nothing to do with all this nonsense going on. So there's like no good officers. Napoleon goes AWOL and demands back pay. And they give it to him. They surrender it unto the goat, which is just hilarious to me. So, you know, he's getting his chops. Basically, he becomes a brigadier general, what we refer to as a one-star general today, very quickly. And you know, he serves through the siege of Paris, and he famously says, you know, a whiff of grape shot would have saved the monarchy. He's basically just like, everyone else is, they're being pussies right now. Like, if we would just opened up the cannons, and grape shot is kind of like a shotgun blast from a cannon. Normally cannons are loaded with, you know, a cannonball, but cannons can also be loaded with a bunch of like pellets, basically, like ball bearings, and shot out, and that's grape shot. And that's what you do against like a cavalry charge, or to suppress a riot or a mob. And Napoleon was just like, in his diaries, you know, he's like, they should have just opened up with the grape shot and everything would have been fine when they were storming the Tuileries and stuff. Fast forward a little bit. This is not exactly step-by-step biographical or like icebergy. It's just kind of in that format. So don't you know, focus too closely on that. So in 1799, he was 30. All right, and this is when he seized power to become first consul in the Brumaire coup. Now, to tell you a little about what was going on in France at this time, so you had the first stage of the revolution, which was Maximilien Robespierre and all that freak stuff he was into. Well, he got guillotined, hilariously, righteously, by the very mob he had created. He was a freak. And then it was that pretty much ended the terror. That ended the wanton bloodshed and slaughter and all the peasants rising up. So then you had what was called the Directory. And the Directory was somewhat better, but still a mess. It was still democracy, you know, but it was basically, there was a lower house and an upper house. There was a lower house consisting of 500, known as the Council of 500, and an upper house known as the Council of Ancients, which is kind of like, you know, if you want to think about it like the Congress and the Senate. And then an executive branch of 5 directors, which was called the Directorate. And these 5 guys were just like the wealthiest, most influential, like middle-class guys to survive the revolution, who didn't get their heads chopped off, who weren't aristocrats, and who were able to kind of, you know, weasel their way around enough to be in power. And these guys were just rats, basically. They were straight up rats. There's really no getting around that. Napoleon didn't like them. He had to work with them. And so this is after his campaigns in Italy, and after, you know, some tussling with the German states. And he was a popular figure at this point. Napoleon was the guy who stopped the bleeding, right? And he made France respected again, to a degree, internationally. So people liked him. He was a big deal. He wasn't, you know, the ultimate general of France or anything, but people generally knew his name, in Paris at least. And so during the war, he basically had to ignore all the nonsense these 5 guys were telling him, because he'd be getting contradictory orders one day to the next. You know, Directory 1 says attack. Directory 2 says retreat. Directory 3 says buy more pears. It doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous. So that's the state of it, right? So his coup, he gets approached by this one member of the Directory and his friend. And they're like, hey buddy, what if we overthrow the Directory and do like a based trad Roman consulate and we remake like the Roman Republic? And Napoleon's like, this is kind of cringe, but it's definitely better than what we have now. And these two guys that he's doing it with, they're kind of speds to begin with. But he's like, yeah, sure, buddy, I'll let you rule with me. Yeah, sure, dude. I'll just be the military guy, and you guys could be like the lawgivers or whatever. That's totally gonna work. So he goes along with it. Now, this all happens at what's called the Chateau de Saint-Cloud, which is just like a palatial estate outside Paris. Now, normally this body, the Council of 500, met in Paris, but here was their plot, basically. So the plot began on November the 9th, 1799, with spreading rumors of a Jacobin plot to circulate to justify emergency measures. The Jacobins were the like super aggressive, atheistic ideology and political party that was behind the terror. This was Robespierre's party, the Jacobins. So there's a couple factions. There was the Royalists, the Jacobins, and then kind of like more pragmatic reformers like Napoleon. And they were kind of on the middle of two extremes. People had totally turned against the Jacobins by this time because they went wild during the terror. So people didn't like them. So they spread rumors, the Jacobins, there's a Jacobin plot, we need more security. So he gets the meeting moved outside Paris to this more isolated, safe estate, right? Napoleon was appointed commander of the troops in Paris to protect the councils. By evening, the coup seemed successful. Coup, not a coup. I don't know why I do that. I say that word all the time. It seemed successful in Paris. Napoleon had basically colluded with the director of police. He's this guy who had been in there for like 40 years. He was a total survivor. And Napoleon had got him on his side because he was pretty practical like him. So he gets the meeting moved to the chateau outside of Paris. He brings his, not grenadiers. They were grenadiers. His grenadiers, his hussars under Murat, his famous cavalry commander, who was kind of a snake in the end, but we're not here to talk about that today. So he basically surrounds this compound, and his brother, Lucien, his younger brother, is actually a member of the 500. He's the president of the lower house, kind of like the Speaker of the House in American politics. So he gets him surrounded, he calls an emergency meeting, and he walks in, and he starts giving this speech. Napoleon's like, hey, he lays it out. He's like, the Directory is ridiculous. We have to change this. We need an executive in command who can actually do something. We have to change this. And it doesn't go great. They just start booing him. And Napoleon's like, your boos mean nothing. I've seen what makes you cheer, you scoundrels, But it doesn't go well. And they all have these little ceremonial daggers. So they like pull out their daggers and they force them out. So, round one doesn't go as planned. So instead, he actually brings in the troops and kind of confines them. And he's like, okay, you're going to listen to me now. And he has his grenadiers with their bayonets out chill out, don't pull out your little pig stick or just listen. So his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who's pretty well respected, he joins in and he's like, this is my brother. He's a great general. He will save the Republic, and I will, they do a bit of theater. He pulls out his own dagger, and he's like, I will kill him if, I swear I will kill my brother if he betrays the Republic, blah, 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 all this stuff. And this goes on for a few hours. And eventually, Napoleon does get what he wants. They legislatively and legally dissolve the Directorate. And they create the consulship, the consulate. And there's supposed to be 3 consuls, right? Napoleon and these 2 other guys. But pretty quickly, Napoleon just kind of absorbs their duties, and they're not really in the picture anymore. And this goes on, of course, until Napoleon, becomes emperor and stuff. But everyone knows all that, right? But that was the coup at Brumaire, right? And it was pretty interesting. Napoleon created the idea of the plot. He got the meeting moved. He was able to isolate it with his troops and get them to bloodlessly, no one died during this. It wasn't violent. He has used a bit of force, a bit of leverage to get him to, declare him the dictator, basically, in the Greek sense, and it was great. So we talked a bit about Lucian. This was probably the last time any of Napoleon's siblings were remotely useful to him. Lucian helped during the coup, but after that he was pretty regarded. Joseph, his older brother, eventually became the king of Spain, but unfortunately he was pretty highly regarded. His sisters were hot, at least, but they didn't marry well enough to help him support his dynasty. So this is the chateau. I didn't show these earlier. This is the Chateau St. Cloud, where this all has happened at. This is Joseph, his older brother. You can kind of see the resemblance there. This is Lucian, the younger brother. You can see the resemblance there as well. This is Paulina. It's kind of hard to find a picture of her without her tits out, but I want to try and keep YouTube TOS, so we'll have this kind of oil painting here. So, everyone knows about Josephine, right? The Empress Josephine. She was a strumpet, a harlot even. She cheated on him multiple times. She was a single mother, so what do you expect with that, really? But Napoleon tried his best. He loved this woman, he did. And he forgave her when she was cheating with Hippolyte Charles, the dashing, one-eyed cavalryman. And he tried his best to keep his marriage together in a traditional way, but it just became too much. And when she couldn't bear children, that was it, And he gave her a very comfortable retirement and married Marie-Louise, the Austrian Archduchess, who was a very good girl and really loved him and gave him a son, the King of Rome. Now, Napoleon himself was a bit of a gamer baiter. Now, let's talk about some more British slander here for a second, okay? Napoleon has a bit of a reputation as a warmonger. But what does that literally mean, right? Let's do an example here. Let's do a hypothetical. Let's say you have two countries, country A and country B. Tensions are high between these countries. Country A has made its intentions clear that they want to attack country B, but they have not formally declared war yet because they're still mobilizing. They're getting ready. Country B, who is already mobilized, declares war and attacks country A in self-defense. Is country B considered an unprovoked aggressor in this instance? I don't think so. And that's what happened the whole time. Napoleon never went to war with anybody that wasn't messing with him first, that just wouldn't leave him alone. In fact, he went out of his way most of the time to try and settle things down and make peace. That's why the Napoleonic Wars are in these sequences. It's multiple phases, because there's peace between them. After he gets rid of the people messing with them, he tries to calm things down. They just wouldn't leave him alone. But there's also the Code Napoleon, his legal reforms. Legality and governance in France was a bit of a snuggle struggle at this time, to be frank. The order that the ancient regime had imposed for centuries was undone with the revolution and the terror. The law was very regionally fractured and a total mess. The Napoleonic Code, comprising 2,281 articles, covered civil law, property, family, contracts, and individual rights, including criminal and constitutional law. Its main features include legality, governance, and it's been adopted in pretty much every single country in Europe, Latin America. Over 70 countries have adopted this word for word, and then amended it a bit to suit their regional tastes. But it was a big deal, and Napoleon created this himself. There were 102 separate drafting sessions. Napoleon went to all of them and wrote a lot of them by his own hand. He had help, of course, from his chief jurist, but as a big brain himself, Napoleon knew that sometimes the Rick and Morty loving lawyers around him needed to be hit in the head with a rock from time to time and address reality rather than pure atheistic legal theory, right? But yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I said, this isn't a military thing. It's more about Napoleon's civil exploits and some of the cool stuff he was involved in. But I hope that was entertaining. I hope you had a good time watching that. If you love Napoleon like I do, I'll probably be making more stuff in the future, focusing on some of his great victories, some of his personal affectations. But yeah, one more thing I want to cover actually, and this is one of the bigger things, is Egypt. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, basically his liberation from the Muslim occupiers, Muhammad Ali and the Mamluks, right? The Mamluk boys, was huge. Now this is before, well, Europeans had been in Egypt and North Africa until the fall of the Roman Empire, basically, and the rise of Islam. And then nothing had been going on there for centuries and centuries. Well, for the first time, Napoleon and his army came in because Egypt was strategic, because the British were using, it was a shipping port, and the British had been in there for a while, kind of as using the Mamluks as a cat's paw to attack French colonies and, the military stuff. But Egypt was totally unknown. And Napoleon basically created a scientific and academic legion, an army of scholars, translators, Egyptologists, cartographers, to go and to figure out what ancient Egypt was about. That not just the surface layer of the Arab and Muslim stuff, but the deep ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics and the tombs and the Roman traditions and everything. And one of the guys he brought with him was the guy who actually found the Rosetta Stone and broke the hieroglyphics. And that's a very interesting story in of itself that I might make a video on, but this was huge for not just human history, but scientific progress and human history in general, everybody. This was a huge undertaking, and Napoleon thought that the scientific and intellectual rigors were just as important as the military victory. And even if you don't like, war or the French or Napoleon or anything like that, you have to really respect this, the uncovering of the Egyptian stuff, because no one had even tried to touch this. The Mamluks were basically just like squatting on the ruins of an advanced civilization. Napoleon chased them out and got to work. And that's just beautiful to me. But yeah, this is a bit of a ramble video, a bit of a quasi-iceberg, a bit of a spurg fest. But that's it for today. If you liked it, consider subscribing. If you hated it, tell me that too. Either way. See you next time.